It's my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. Collins Airhihenbuwa. I'm sorry about the pronunciation. He will be talking about the very exciting topic of global health and why culture matters, and you see the title there on the screen. Professor Airhihenbuwa is a head of the Department of Biobehavioral Health at the Pennsylvania State University. He has been a consultant to the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, UNESCO, UNFPA, and other international agencies. He's the author of the PEN 3 model used to centralize culture in public health and health promotion projects. He has published numerous articles, book chapters, and other books. His books include Health and Culture Beyond the Western Paradigm. I think it's available tonight, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. One of his books will be available for purchase if you are interested. And then the next book is UNAIDS Communication Framework for HIV/AIDS, A New Direction, and his 2007 book titled Healing Our Differences, The Crisis of Global Health and the Politics of Identity. He was the principal investigator on a 5-year NIMH grant on capacity building for research on HIV/AIDS stigma in South Africa. He is also the principal investigator on a 5-year Fogarty NIH Global Health and Geo-Resource Grant to address public health training and capacity building in Nigeria. And I should say that his presence, here at the Center for Global Humanities is a testimony that the Center for Global Humanities is an attempt by us to address the critical issues related to health. And we are delighted to have him, and please help me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, good evening, or is it afternoon, depending on where you draw the threshold of afternoon and evening. How many of you were in the lecture this morning? Good. So I get to repeat the same thing I said this morning. No. But I will start with the same premise as a way of drawing a link between what I shared this morning or afternoon with what I want to share with you, even though the direction will be different. It's a story I have in my book that I, from time to time, like to use to foreground the conversation that I like to engage in. And I said this morning I prefer to think about this exchange as a polylogue and not a dialogue, as a way of engaging a collective conversation, one that allows us to appreciate the different experiences we bring to the table. It's a story of two men that represent my hybrid identity, a Nigerian and an American, who went to the graveside to pay respect to their loved ones who's passed on. The American had a bouquet of roses, and the Nigerian had a pot of soup. They knelt side by side and to do what we would do to any loved one who's passed on. But, the curiosity got the best of the American and looked over to the Nigerian and said, well, when do you think your wife will wake up to eat the soup, or to have the soup? To which the Nigerian looked over to the American and responded, well, I suppose as soon as your wife wake up to smell those roses. The lesson of it is that a number of the things that we talk about in culture do not have to have the logic of their utility. Is the degree to which we will go to fight for not just right, but the privilege to engage in them, because whether it's roses or soup, they really have no practical utility for those who've passed on. It's a way of different groups subscribing and holding on to that which they believe connect them to those who've passed on. And that is really the lesson of culture, that we don't really think in terms of one superior to the other, but we think in terms of differences and how you begin to embrace those differences and recognizing that wherever we stand is actually a particular location and all the lenses that privilege such location in looking at possibilities and what is good and what is bad and so on and so forth. The other thing I always like to say at the beginning of a talk is that if anyone were looking for a solution, I'm sort of the wrong person to look up to for it, because my work is about questioning the question and not providing solution or how you address a particular issue. But it's the process of questioning the question that we begin to unpack all the ways of knowing that are considered normal or privileged depending on the location from which we look at these issues. And with that, let me just say the 4 areas from which I want to share my thought with you tonight, and the whole question of what global health means. And then the problems with global impact, global health in a new world order, and the whole issue of identity and culture as discursive landscapes. What do we mean by global health? Well, there are different definitions, and I'll get into some of the ways we got to where we are in the area of global health in a few minutes. But first, I think it's very important to look at the way some thinkers, previous, current, and coming up, have given us different sort of lessons to allow us to resist the temptation to be so tunnel vision and linear in our thinking and engage in something that is more robust and deals with the idea of complexity. And the notion of double consciousness that Du Bois had advanced as a sort of a way of, at the time, considered a prophecy of how he saw America, and that failure to deal with this binarism of the center and the margin, or those who have and those who do not have, and in this case, blacks living in a white and black world, that failure to deal with not just race, but racism is going to be, in a sense, our downfall if we don't tackle it. And of course, other scholars have taken that to even a different level. That we have Darlene Clark Hines, a historian, who said if Du Bois ever think of his two-ness, he will wonder how African-American women feel about their five-ness, where you begin to look at the intersection of race and gender and what comes with the different agency that a black woman has to assume, whether it's privileged or disadvantaged, from poverty to what she faces and so on and so forth. The second person whose work I like to draw on, and I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Noam Chomsky, and I'm particularly drawn to the work on in the book In Necessary Illusion, where he basically cautioned that we ought to be very careful about focusing too much on honesty of decision make or integrity of those who make the decision, but rather we need to be focusing on the framework that define certain choices that are made. And we know that we engage in all sorts of study where we really like to know how honest people are and how sincere they are. But again, because we are looking for answers, we tend to forget about the question of how those issues are framed, which led to the whole notion of manufactured consent, which I will share a few illustrations to really talk about how we sometimes collectively buy into idea and normalize it, even though it doesn't really represent what the reality is, based reality meaning how the populace may feel about an issue. We can't say that some of the changes we see in the world with youth seeking and finding voice is a way of trying to really challenge the manufactured consent that has been normalized in their respective spaces, because it has been a sense that these youth have always believed in these leaders. But to have a space, a voice to say, but whatever notion of cohesion was conveyed, it was indeed manufactured. It wasn't really representing the sense of the masses. And then we get to Chimamanda Adichie, who is a young writer described as the literary daughter of Chinua Achebe, and I said to the group this morning, if you want to have 30 minutes of insightful review of a video, just Google Adichie, Adichie, and put in The Danger of a Single Story. And I think you'll be in for a treat, where this young writer talks about the notion of framing identity as this very single, simple image, and that influenced the way we think about a population once we narrow down this group to this very simple image of who we think they are and what we think they represent. We've now begun to, this is 2011, we have election next year, so we are back to using the dualized color representation of the political landscape as it were in this country, where red is for one group, blue is for the other. If you were making a visual analysis of this, it would appear that one dominates the others, and that there are really no differences within any of the group. But cartographers have been very good to us in allowing us to understand the importance of proportional representation of people to geographic space. This story tells one, but if we were to remap the shape of the U.S. with proportional representation of people to space, this is probably what we will be looking at, given the densely populated Northeast and West, assuming we actually accept the red and blue dyad as a way of understanding the political landscape in this country. But supposing that there is really no true red or blue, that in a state like mine, Pennsylvania, where some politicians have used a sort of a tongue-in-cheek, I can't remember who first said this now, that Pennsylvania is Pittsburgh and Philadelphia with Alabama in the middle. I tend to look at it as a state that actually represents all the diversity that you have in the country. But the serious part about this is, if we were using the red and blue, is very different when you do an intra-state analysis, because there are areas that lean towards one political orientation and areas towards, so you couldn't really say there's a true red or blue. But if you even take it further, recognizing that it is not actually unusual in a family for one spouse to be leaning towards one party and the other spouse leaning towards the other. The governor and the former governor and first lady of California represented that very well. So the other scholars started saying, maybe the representation of red and blue is misguided, that what we probably have is something that is quite different. But where manufactured consent becomes the norm, and we are focusing on the intention, honesty of the people who advance ideas or their integrity, we then tend to overlook what the messages are being given to us mean or doesn't mean that we in fact do not have a true red or blue. But let's move it forward to how I learn or you learn about Africa. In school, this is the map of the world. And we have all the different locations in place, and this makes perfect sense based on how we were taught to view the map, at least on the flat surface, the global map. I'll come back to Chinua Achebe, and one of the lessons of many references I've made to his work is that he has said that no man should enter his house through another man's gate. No man should enter his house through another man's gate. And I could say that one of the challenge and perhaps the vision of a place like a Center for Global Humanity is taking on that issue of, first of all, what are the different gates and how do you recognize them when you see them? In other words, how do you bring a collective together where the intersectionality becomes actually some of the most exciting point of intellectual inquiry and not the disciplinary orientation that is really somehow truncated our knowledge or ability to actually see beyond what is possible. But if you look at it from the standpoint of a math, this is what you will see if you walk into my office. We said the world is turned upside down, but why is this not the normal way of presenting the global map? Who says the north is the north and the south is the south? It's a question that prompted a Canadian to redraw the world map and located Canada in the center. It's a question that prompted an Australian to redraw the world map, being tired of the notion of the down under, and placed Australia not just at the center but on top. So the question of what we've normalized as the position of any space is as much political as it is intellectual. So what is central and what is margin is what we really try to engage in a conversation around culture so that we are not talking about what is superior to the other, but how do they relate, what are similarities, and what are differences, and what are important differences that ought to be recognized. And this has been the really true preoccupation of scholars whose work that a number of us still continue to draw from, Frantz Fanon and Cheikh Anta Diop too. We also know that the work, I should go back and say, I have often said that if you are a psychologist or a psychiatrist and you haven't studied Fanon, that you have been miseducated. The notion of not only being interested and focused on the life of the oppressed, but also being equally interested and focusing on the thinking and logic of the oppressor, and that this becomes very crucial and very important in trying to understand connectivity and the notion of center or margin. Cheikh Anta Diop, for whom the University of Dakar was later renamed, and the Egyptologist took 10 years for the Sorbonne to give him his degree because he dared say Egyptians were Africans. Then the notion that he's raised that once you start raising question or questioning the question, then the analysis of your work quickly turns to your own mental health, whether or not you are crazy or you're actually normal, rather than taking on the test and or the thesis that you are advancing in your work. And his work continued to inspire many to question the question. Toni Morrison, that in number of not just the Nobel work, but one of the most powerful work I've seen of Toni Morrison is a very thin book called Playing in the Dark, where basically he took up some of the issues that Fanon raised and questioning iconic writers and giants like the Hemingway, and whether or not they chose to use certain racialized term in third person as opposed to first person, advancing on or seeking refuge in the character that doesn't speak in first person as a way of truly revisiting the way in which differences and similarity is being inscribed in what is considered to be quite normal for us. The clear conscience of Nigeria, Wole Soyinka, who's really raised a lot of questions as to the notion of citizenship. What does it mean? He even raised the question, is it just about having passport? What does global citizenship mean? And what does it mean when something is happening in Wisconsin? Do we feel connected to it? Or is it when it's happening in Egypt that what is our emotional response when we look at what is happening in Wisconsin as opposed to what happened in Tunisia? Do we see a sense of connectedness to one group more than the other? So the question of how global are you in our professed location as global citizen? So there's a lot that Soyinka has also taught us. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whose work, and again, beyond the literary work, in decolonizing the mind, started talking about the notion of cultural bomb, how we advance this way of thinking that actually literally obliterate what is there culturally. And I could go into a series of lectures to look at, if you take even the area of spirituality, which I'll speak to towards the end of my talk, what we privilege and what we consider to be either on the margin or clearly an aberration. And of course, Wangari Maathai, in terms of the Nobel laureate from Kenya, in terms of how struggle and challenge in the greening of the environment and what that is done into a new call for agency that must be reclaimed at different level by different people across the world. The role of global health with all this has always been central and important. But as a colleague added, because the title on that LANCET that is now the most important foreign policy issue of our time, and Thomas Quinn at Hopkins added global, that we should actually think of global health as the most important foreign policy issue of our time. And the reason is quite clear, that when we begin to look at how society progress or achieve certain level of whether it's equity or responding to humanity, we look at it based on health outcome and health measure. And there are a number of ways that is come to us. But there are other magazine important work that begin to showcase why global health is so critical for what we do, and that we need to begin to think about what it means to address a disease or a condition that affects us collectively. But the issue of global health has also been the issue of how do you transform a hegemonic gaze while you are under its influence? How do you transform an oppressive gaze while you are functioning under its power? And this is really the issue of being taught to think theoretically from a particular perspective that puts the individual at the center, while at the same time we are trying to wrestle with issues that really do not respond to individual change alone without a clear understanding of the context that shape the individual. Tobacco is one of the areas where we have claimed success in public health. And yet the success we have in tobacco has very little to do with targeted smoking cessation program and a lot to do with intervention that were happening at the institutional policy contextual level. from the work of Kessler at FDA, getting a lot of scientists together to begin to look at the role of nicotine in overall health, trying to make a case for why secondhand smoking is dangerous, and at the same time trying to make a case for why we must change the warning on cigarette package from saying smoking is related to something to saying smoking causes something, because that was a part of the major debate. But it was also happening at a time when Ralph Nader and others were engaged in social transformation to stigmatize smoking and actually normalize not smoking as a way of, as a new form, a new cultural order, if you will. And I know that for a number of you in the audience, you will recall a time where cigarette smoking was restricted to the back of the airplane. And if you flew, you were probably one of those who end up having a seat next to the smoking session, and you didn't smoke. But with time, we got rid of cigarette from the airplane. Then we moved into the restaurants and created a section, and then we removed it. We moved into buildings, university building, created a section, and we removed it. We are in public spaces, and the mayor of New York is saying the park cannot be a place where you smoke. And there's a debate going on as to why should that be? This is an open space. It's a way of really recognizing that it's a social transformation, changes in the context that create a lower threshold of tolerance for cigarette. Because those of us who were accustomed to being in a party or social function where people smoke around us and didn't bother us, started to see a gradual decline in our threshold of tolerance for cigarette, where, as I said this morning, if I walk into a room where somebody smoked last week, I will smell it and I will demand to get a different room. But it's a way of really understanding the whole issue of cigarette, that it requires a multidisciplinary approach, but beyond multi, it requires an interdisciplinary approach, a transdisciplinary method that I like to call scholarship without borders. The notion of intersectionality, where you are not handicapped with the ideas and limits of your discipline, but what is actually driving you is how to come up with a collective way of rethinking what we confront or what confronts us. Two examples I cited this morning that even within cigarette, the limit of trying to come up with individual-based change of behavior that fail to take into account the why people may engage in a particular behavior. And the two examples I cited were a study that actually was championed by nurses. I failed to say that this morning. This was a study that was reported in Bournemouth, England, at a qualitative research conference that I attended years ago. It was a case of going back to find out why women smoke. There was a mother of three that suddenly realized over time that as soon as she picked up a cigarette and lights it, the children knew it was time for mom to be alone. They left her and just moved into the other room. That was one case. There was a second case of a woman who was involved, who was in an abusive relationship, and she had noticed with time that when the argument was getting to a level where it was going to result in her being struck, and she were to light a cigarette, the husband did not hit her. And so where you have program trying to get these women to stop smoking without ever looking at, on a broader scale, what are the most serious risk individuals face in their life, where the logic of smoking makes sense in those instances because it wasn't just the adverse health consequence that was of primary concern to the two women who were looked at. There are a number of other things that we can look at, but that is just in smoking. But of course, this is the new frontier, right? We are now faced with obesity, and there is a question and an assumption, I should say, that whatever we did for smoking somehow is going to work for obesity reduction. And because we are still working with the same framework that informed how we develop intervention that focused on individual. Now you have one substance that you don't need, and we're able to get rid of it. And you can, as in fact, a part of the intervention for smoking was to stigmatize it. Then you have a different reality where we all eat. We need to eat to survive. Is what constitutes what is in the food, how you eat it, where you eat it, what actually makes up the food that you have to take into account in this case. So what works for smoking is not going to work for obesity reduction. But clearly, whatever is going to work is going to require an intervention at the contextual policy making level. I came to the U.S. from Nigeria in 1977. The size of large fries then is smaller than the size of small fries today. We know that portion size has gone up. That is nothing really new. But what is interesting is that when we talk about portion size, we tend to focus on fast food restaurant. For us to be able to normalize a certain food size, family restaurant has to be on board, and they have been on board for years. They've gotten us accustomed to not finishing what we are served. In fact, it becomes even a point of advertising. I can give you more than you can ever eat, and that you take food home. And then we see this as one of the measures of what makes really a good restaurant. But beyond that, we fail to recognize that you need a bigger plate to serve these dishes. So the plate dish manufacturers are following in line as well. The platters are bigger. With the platter bigger, well, you just need a bigger cup to go with it. Or why not? The utensils needs to be longer, and the spoon needs to be larger. So if for you to actually try to eat in the way we would recommend you eat, you have to get rid of all the platters in your home, make the dessert plate and salad plate the main dish, and then sort of condition everyone to start looking at what constitutes a normal portion size for your body to function. In the absence of these structural changes, you are not going to be able to just tell people, eat less. If the body demanding, someone respond. The large ice cream scoop in France is smaller than the small ice cream scoop in the US. That you have the French smaller in frame has nothing to do with any intellectual endowment that they are given. They have an environment designed to increase energy expenditure and decrease what you take, whether it's in terms of the quality of the food available, the notion that you become accustomed to paying for that, to know that it costs money to eat well, so your budget is going to account for that, and to knowing that you're going to walk almost everywhere. We actually have studies that show people in Manhattan are better fit than people who live in the other boroughs of New York, because people, for one reason or the other, if it's just for having to get up and move your car from one side of the street to the other, people walk, and you walk to where you're going. And these are ways that we don't think about, and we start thinking about built environment, but they are environment where these are already built, and it's a part of the way we function. In the absence of contest, it is not the intention or honesty of the opinion expressed. It's the framework that normalizes certain way of connecting and relating that lead us to the health issues with which we have to contend. And that is where culture matters. And then it's become an issue that the World Health Organization commissioned a group, and the researcher was a former Surgeon General, represented the US, to look at what has been the issues confronting us in the area of social determinants of health, which became a big area that drew in different scholars from different fields. That somehow we came to the realization that there are social determinants that influence the way we think about health. So they came up with a report in 2008 that basically gave 3 recommendations: improve daily living condition, tackle inequity in distribution of power, and come up with a different way to measure impact and access to action. We sort of recognize this, but they're making the case that these are very important: improve living condition. And then we started talking about built environment, inequity, whether it's disparity in quantitative terms or inequity in qualitative terms, which is a much more broader way of representing the gap, the gender gap, and then coming up with a new way of thinking about how we measure whether or not we achieve our goal or not, because the way we are doing it now doesn't really help us. So one example of why this recommendation is important is this is how we will look at life expectancy between countries. Japan on top, US just above Cuba in looking at life expectancy. But the recommendation from the group on social determinant was basically saying differences between countries doesn't tell us the whole story. We need to know about intra-national, intra-regional differences. If you look at this life expectancy table, and I was saying this morning, the other thing that troubled me about life expectancy, I'm always amused and a bit disturbed to have people confuse it with longevity. It is assumed as though if you say life expectancy is 60, that there are no 61-year-olds in the society that is just at that level. It's really an aggregate information that looks at what the probability is that the child born within that period up to 1 year will live to a certain level. It's very sensitive to high infant mortality rate. If you calculate life expectancy at age 5, the gap between rich and poor country becomes very narrow. But beyond that, one of the lessons of this was really to look at not Lansing and Carlton in Glasgow, Scotland, to look at the difference in life expectancy in that region. Now, you don't have to know where this place is. All you have to know is that the distance between these two places is 8.4 miles. All right? And then we can also give you a different example closer to home, Montgomery County and Washington, D.C. There are stark differences. What is the distance between these two places where you have such a disparity in life expectancy, 28 miles? So it begins to really bring the picture of the context. It isn't about how we position ourselves, or it's the U.S. and we compare to Japan. The differences within is sometimes larger than the differences between. So a part of trying to understand the direction of why context is so important is that the singular representation of a country with number can be so misleading that you miss a lot of things that really go on in between. And one of the ways that this has been misleading is that we tend to focus on disease. Let's just focus on people and use a number that says, assuming the world population was 100, we are really dealing with 61 Asians, 14 African, 11 European, 9 Latin American, as is the number shows. 52 female, 70 non-white, 70 non-Christian, 6, maybe it's 5 now, there's somebody from when this was done, own 59% of all wealth. 80 live in substandard houses, 70 unable to read and write, 50 suffer from malnutrition, 1 has a college education. As you look at huge global number, just break it down to 100, and let's even focus on spirituality and religion. So what are we really looking at, and on what are the theories and models anchored? The story of a program in South Africa when I was there, there is an exam that all high school students take. Imagine the SAT is actually a national exam, and before the national exam, you will take a mock exam that prepares you for that national exam. And after taking the mock exam, there will be a television program where an English teacher will be there. Now today's program is on English. So you will ask the English teacher, here is how I responded to this question on the mock exam. If you were to really come up in the real exam, do you think this is a good way to respond? So that is the background, and this is real. So the young man called, and the teacher described what he was saying. I don't even remember what he described, but what struck me was that the teacher asked him, do you read the Bible? And he was silent. And she had to ask again, I'll ask you, do you read the Bible? I'm not trying to ask to convert you. I'm trying to say, the reason I ask you this question is, if you are working with English literature and you don't read the Bible, or you haven't read the Bible, there's a lot you are going to miss. That a lot of things in English literature is coded with biblical terms. So the notion of sin, where do you think it came from? So if you really want to understand the question you are asking me, you have to understand the religious basis of what you are reading in literature. Quite interesting. So the notion of the representation of different population in the world and what occupy a dominant space in what we expect people to learn, and why we have difficulty because we don't understand the group that represent 70% of the world. So I will use my notion of lesson in Africa as a way of sharing the way I approach some of these issues and why it's so important, and capacity building becomes so central to my work. That I'm going to use African expression and talk about, and then I also punctuate it with lessons from my Native American elders that I've worked with in the past 2 years in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The African expression of Until the Lions produced their own historians. The story of the hunt will glorify always the hunter. So in capacity building is how do you produce the historians that are going to reflect their own story. For the Native American, the expression is the longest journey you will ever take is the journey between your head and your heart. We treat people a particular way or teach particular issue. We know the context is important. We sit down and write grants that focus on the individual basis because we think that is where the funding is. We know that is where the funding is. So the reconciling the head and the heart is a constant struggle for the academic because there's a realization of where the work should be. And it's true in global work across the different disciplines. The issue of producing your own historian it's really a story of ownership. And the story of ownership was best retold by Chinua Achebe, again, in one of his books. This is on hopes. The book is entitled Hopes and Impediment. It's a story of, I use different animals. It's a story of a toad and a snake. The toad was on top of, the toad was on the sidewalk observing a snake that owned a horse riding along a path. The snake looked so sloppy on the saddle. It's just going around, you just cannot situate itself properly. So at a point, the toad got really exasperated. What are you doing? riding a horse? Come down, let me teach you how you ride a horse. So they slid down, and the toad got on, positioned itself firmly, and proceeded to ride the horse along the path the way a good horse rider will ride a horse. And came back and said, now that is how you ride a horse. And the snake said, thank you very much. Please come down. Came down. The snake slid back on the saddle and said, to know is good, but to own is better. What is the point of being a good horse rider when you don't own a horse? So the question of ownership is so central to how we are addressing issue of culture. We sometimes become so masterful at that which we don't own, and start to wrestle with what the whole issue of knowledge acquisition, how we produce knowledge, and so on and so forth. You've heard this: no one should enter his or her house through someone else's gate. For my Native American, I'm appropriating equivalent, is walking backward and facing forward, because you want to keep your eyes on the prize and being focused on what you're doing. The gate is a part of the search you have to engage in, knowing where the gate lies. And one of the issues that I've faced recently in working in African countries is that the stage in life where one becomes an elder, what we call positive aging, has a cultural interpretation that is so different across contexts. In the US, when you get, the older you get, the more you are still able to do things for yourself, the more positive we value your aging process. In Nigeria, the older you get, the more you have younger ones running around that you can send errands to go take care of things, the more we value your positive aging. In fact, it will be a major embarrassment to the children and grandchildren to have mama or papa doing something when the rest of you are just there. What are you doing? So those with the resources over time have sent their children overseas. So we are facing an era where the notion of positive aging that we once knew in Nigeria is eroding. So at the same time, the notion of positive aging in the US is not necessarily the desire of those who are getting to that stage in Nigeria. So here is an issue of how do we now define positive aging? No one should enter their home through someone else's gate. So I'm challenging my colleagues. So you have a different situation that may not exist other places, that may exist differently. You have to come up with a different way of trying to understand this, particularly for those who are affected. The last part is what has become sort of a mantra of mine, that the question I ask, do you know who you are without what you do? Do you know who you are without what you do? It's very easy for us to say, I'm a professor, I'm a director, I'm this and that. We go into the community and we start asking people questions, not based on whatever title they have, but based on who they are. But we can't even articulate who we are. If you don't understand who you are, how do you really expect to connect with people at the level that you are trying to engage them? And some of the major flaw in the work that we do in an engaging community, in my judgment, is that we don't know who we are without what we do. And for the Native American, that is the journey where you start walking towards yourself. So a global engagement is actually meant to be, in part, a journey where you walk towards yourself. And for students who go outside and are seeking to reproduce who they are in that space, they're actually missing the point. The point is that encounter, you are supposed to make mistake. You are supposed to not be afraid of me. It's what you are learning from that process. To the extent that we think we can provide every conceivable protective information and gear for our students going outside, we are doing them a disservice. they are supposed to fail in certain aspects and learn from it. And that really is the experience of global engagement. And globalization, for me, by the way, doesn't mean crossing the geographic boundary of the US to another country. It's trying to understand how different identity, different cultural contexts contribute to the collective pool of knowledge in globalization. You're familiar with Millennium Development Goal as one of the different ways, and I highlighted the HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases as one that we tend to focus on. But there are so many other areas that we like to look at. But I always raise this question, what is global health? And I wanted to come back to it. I've asked my students to tell me what it is, and they come up with this definition: the helping, the need, resources, and so on and so forth. So let me go back to why I asked the question, because there is a trend that started with tropical medicine through international health to where we are in global health. Tropical medicine was basically you train clinicians to take care of problems that do not occur in your own geographic location. And it was a helping model. It was fine, but it was a helping model. We moved beyond that. Some schools still have that. Tulane still have it in their title, and London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine still has that. There's nothing wrong with it, but it does address certain things and has a serious limitation. Because as Amadou Hampateba, the Malian historian, once said, the hand that gives is always on top. So in the model of giving, the question is, what is the level of the hand that receives? So tropical medicine is the hand that gives. In international health, we started to move into, well, let's include non-clinicians still in the mix. We are still going to do something of exchanging, but it's still a part of giving. And we are still in that, not really quite sure. It's international. So the relationship between government is at the governmental level. USAID and CEDA and a number of the European nations having their international, what they call foreign arms, that engage in bilateral agreement. So that still went on. Globalization actually started when, in the way we know it, even though it's been there, written about, talked about, the reality of it actually started when Bill Gates entered the picture and the foundation, moving funding from 87 for HIV is less than $1 million to over 10 billion in 2007 of giving. That the picture changed because the terms of engagement and rules of engagement were altered. It was no longer a question of government to government. It can be private citizen money to other private citizen. Even though there were other foundations like the Rockefeller and Ford, but they've always typically followed the line of the government in terms of exchange. But what became very clear was that relationship has to stop being simply binational. It has to be complex, multiple, and that complexity is good. And that it has to really engage people who are on the ground. And therefore, the new motto for me for global engagement or global health is not helping, but sharing. Going somewhere knowing that you have a lot to learn from that population as much as you think you are going to share with them. So for my student in our global health minor, the first message is, if you think you are going to teach anybody anything or save anybody, this is not the program for you. You are going there to work towards yourself because your encounter is meant to as much challenge you, learning from the space you are going to occupy, as much as you are trying to share some of the things that you've learned. And that, to me, is the way I see global health, that we are moving from the issue of need and help to the question of learning and sharing. And it has to be bi-directional, that we're really not looking at just extending your hand, but being able to embrace, think of other ways of engaging in a communal co-learning situation. Last year, November, I was asked by UNFPA, United Nations Population Fund, the African Regional Office, to evaluate a program in Malawi. And this was a village of Pitala, and we were looking at maternal mortality reduction, what has been going on there. We work with local people, local consultant in Lilongwe, to begin to talk to those that UNFPA have partnered with to understand how they were dealing with maternal mortality reduction. What is quite interesting for me is because in every community, I like to understand how those who are on the ground co-create knowledge, a different way of trying to address some issues with which they are confronted. This is a private clinic. On the left was an attempt to increase or to reduce maternal mortality, and what they built was for people who live, say, 2 hours ride away from the clinic. They created a space where they could come when it's closer to delivery and stay there so that they are right next to the clinic. They listed the number of births per year. That is actually the number grew from 396 in 2006 to 1774 in 2009, and they had not, and it tells you the increase in demand. But the personnel did not necessarily grow up. The young man with the jacket is the only physician. I asked him, when do you sleep? He said, well, when the baby stopped coming. When do you wake up? When the first baby is coming. The lady at the right is the nurse. Sometimes she gets help, sometimes she doesn't. So because there are people behind the progress they are trying to, the goal they are trying to achieve and the progress made, my concern and message to UNFPA, if we don't get them more help and more support, you can't be looking at a catastrophic situation. The point here is that the people I saw there were more dedicated than any group of health professionals that I've seen. But when we are looking at the situation on the ground, it's as though people are just waiting around for help, that they are not doing something, that they're not doing anything. And then we went to the village and talked to the village headman. That is basically how they are called, a village headman. This is the woman who is head of the village that we went to. And I asked, among the many things that she shared that they've done, I said, when the first funding ended, what did you do in the village? He said, well, we got a group of people, we got all the villagers together and said, what have you learned in this process, and what would you like to keep? Everyone started saying, well, there are a number of messages that we've heard that we would like to share with others, people who come from other villages and also amongst ourselves. How would you like to do this? We would like to figure out a way to write down the most important message that we've learned so that others can see about it. And if anybody wants to ask us questions, they can knock on the door and ask us questions. Well, and she said, well, why don't you just write it on the wall of your building? So each person pick whatever they actually like, whether it's a message of get care, that is prenatal care is important, any general message, they write it in Chichewa, which is the national language. And if you are walking by and you really want to know more about this information, you knock on the door and ask the owner to tell you more about it. The idea did not come from us. I have not seen it anywhere. I've done evaluations several places. So the notion that we have the information to share, because we're always giving brochure, we're always ready with information to go distribute, where pamphlet and brochure distributed in this community, I don't think that conversation would have come up. But given the opportunity to engage the community and say, what do? We don't need money for this. We're going to do it ourselves. And that is what they did. And then what started happening was others from other villages were coming to learn from them in terms of how to draw on your own resources within the community. Global health is not about across the border. I'm also working with Native American and different groups in the US. 2 years ago, in a place called Gallup, 2.5 hours from Albuquerque, New Mexico, when you go up there, we went to a sacred ground where we hosted about 20 youth from different community, Asian American, Filipino, African American, and different group, youth leaders who are involved in community organizing. And this was an initiative led by the White Flower Institute in San Francisco that had approached me to work with them on how do you unleash the rich cultural heritage and the rich spiritual heritage, and how do you create a sacred space, spiritual space with which people come to voice and recognize that spirituality actually cut across different areas, and that we need to have an anchor on which to build this experience for young people who represent different spiritual heritage. So we decided we're going to work with Pablo Lopez, who is in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and our spiritual leader, Uncle Everett Baldwin, and that's the spiritual leader that will put blessing. And this teepee we built when we arrived there, and there were about 3 different teepee, gender segregated, and all the food and everything we had on the ground. There is an exercise we go through that is model building. It's a different kind of model building that business executives go through. This is where you use figurine and ask people to build a model of their community. You don't have to rely on the skill in drawing and using drawing to express yourself, or you don't have to rely on the level of literacy to asking people to write. You can ask people to just pick certain items and talk about their community, and that is what we did. We do go through a NIPI ceremony, and this is the best I can show you on that because you don't really share it, what you may hear of as the sweat lodge, as a way of going through that experience of a spiritual rebirth, because the entrance and exit are the same. You go into your mother's womb to come back out, and all the things that you engage in it is part of the process. For the Native American, the earth is the center, it's not people. There are no sins and there's nothing to forgive. So it's a very different way of understanding the spiritual anchor that guide how people relate, how people make connections. So the native cosmology became the centerpiece of what we talk about. And we have the Lao Yumian community in Oakland also involved in our project. The Lao Yumian refers to as the mountain people that sided with the U.S. during the Vietnam War and went through a lot of, there were repercussions at the end. So beginning with the Carter administration, there were mass immigration that ended with the Reagan administration, a huge settlement area in Oakland, California. The Lao Yumian, and this is there's an aspect of Buddhism that is a part of their culture, but not quite. This is Kimpan. And they built a temple 3 years ago, the first one in the U.S., and connecting, a part of the challenge, what I was asked to work with them on, how do you connect young people who are born here, who see themselves as very different from their parents, do not really want to understand the parents' tradition because it's considered retrogressive. And they'll say that I'm an American and I don't want to really relate to that. So the whole idea of how do you understand that you're actually getting the best of both worlds. You can get the best of what the country offers. You can also draw on the strength of what parents subscribe to. So working the young people to have a better appreciation of the parents' heritage. At the same time, working with the parents to understand that they do have a dual identity, and you have to recognize the part they are also bringing to the table to allow this sort of a conversation or a polylogue. But one of the things they did at the temple, because for the youth, one of the most important source of influence for them were their grandparents. When a grandparent died, they have a representation in the temple. So if you want to communicate with your grandparents, you go to the temple. And that is part of how they drew some of the young people back in. So this is really a way of making the case that in global engagement, which I'm glad you have a Center for Global Humanity here, that it's really a way of trying to understand and have a deeper appreciation for the things that connect us and the things that also make us different, those unique features which are equally important, and that there is no superior or one culture being superior to the other. There is no one spirituality that is superior to the other. We have to be able to engage differences. And if we cannot do it in an institution of higher learning, where is it going to take place? If we can get people to at least have that conversation of say, I don't have to believe it, but I can sit down and have a conversation and talk about it. If we are not preparing our students to understand that, then we are actually miseducating them. We are denying them the opportunity to engage in the scholarship of global citizenship. And this has been the preoccupation of the works that has come out, Du Bois' work, The Soul of Black Folks, Wole Soyinka, The Open Soul of a Continent, the invention of women. I talked about Yeronke Oye women that question the negative representation of African women, that she wants to move it from victim to agency, from sisterhood to motherhood as an important agency. Male daughters, female husband, Imagine Me, very important and popular work that is understood. Gungi's work, I talked about, Decolonizing the Mind. Chinua Achebe, The Education of a British Protected Child, is his latest work. Race, a book that took a classic work on race and invited current scholar to address it and respond to it. The racial contract, it took on in the tradition of Pateman's The Sexual Contract. Achieving a Humanity, philosopher that looks at the collective Emmanuel Eze, the late Emmanuel Eze, as you say, that really talks about, in part, going to how race and racism were inscribed in scholarship from the work of Immanuel Kant to present day, what really connects us and what we need to be studying. Or the Bin Samoyo, who wrote Dead Aid Africa, basically questioning the way aid has been distributed and actually contributing to marginalization of the continent, that in fact, for her argument as an economist, she is thinking if you get rid of all the aids, you are going to see progress. And the group this morning would have seen my son in a different context. But basically, when we talk about research method and intervention, that research should be about learning and sharing. The method should involve experiencing and making connection. And the intervention should always recognize the role of culture and the context in which people function. And that perhaps if you do that, you can also reach for this star, as my son is doing.
We have microphones for questions here. Hello? Hello?
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful to hear you speak about this topic. Yesterday, I was at a session here in Portland with mostly families from Africa, and we were talking about how to, it was actually a session that was supposed to be with youth dialogue, but in fact, most of the people who were there were men from the families, and most of them were from Africa. There were some youth there, but you spoke about a little bit about the issue of people coming to another country and then children who are living, for example, here in Portland, who have whose parents have come from Africa, and they may have come from Africa. Some of them have been born here. And I would wonder if you have any resources to help with that issue, because it was something that I think is so important for all of us to think about how to help with these issues, and anything you can help with, I would greatly appreciate.
Thank you for that. The parents need as much support as children do. It's just that parents don't think they need any support. What is said is simply a global phenomenon. We are always making reference to when we walk 20 miles to school and our children are taking the bus, so they have it so easy. So there is this sense that as a parent, you have your responsibilities to lead the way, teach the child, and do everything that the child need. And that doing is based on sometimes a notion that is maybe fossilized in time, and that doesn't really have, especially when you are now dealing with cross-cultural experience. The recognition that you cannot ignore the exposure the child has, and you then have to think about how do you get the child connected to still understand your own upbringing, but that not being the only experience that they are going to have, that there is a different experience or life they are exposed to. And I talk to different groups, and that is what I try to share with them. And I was saying to Jen earlier today was that a group of people in Amsterdam, actually it was 3 cities in Holland, they were using my model to actually work with the same population, immigrant population, and some of the issues they were facing are the same. How do you connect with the children, and how do they better understand how the system functions and what is there? The question of raising question. I talk about questioning the question. In different contexts, we like children not to ask too many questions when we should encourage it. But the thing is that when children start asking questions, you better be prepared or have other resources to make sure you're providing them the correct answer and not avoiding the issue. But it is quite doable. It's being done. But depending on what context I'm in, I raise issue to get us thinking about even the notion of spirituality. I was in the University of Ibadan when they showed me that they had a church there was a church for a long time on university premises, and they showed me with pride that they have now a mosque. And I raised the question again that Wole Soyinka is considered the conscience of the nation, and everyone celebrates his accomplishment. I said, what is really interesting is that he has said that Ogun is his companion deity. If he comes to this university, do you have a space for him to have a spiritual experience? And we're looking at each other. And I raised that because within the community, I try to ask questions around how open are you to options and possibility, and how restricting are you, and how does that translate to what you allow your children to experience or be exposed to. And these are all a part of the issue that ought to be addressed, and it's an ongoing conversation.
I have a comment. First of all, I want to thank you for ending with such an important slide, because it really speaks to the community-based collaborative nature of how programs should be implemented and how we should approach them. And also, thank you for opening our eyes to the idea that doing this work in a thoughtful way is about assessment and not about interventions. And the learning, the sharing, the experiencing, and the connecting are all so critical. I think we lose sight of what we think things may be altruistic when in fact we exude cultural arrogance because we want to help so much when in fact we don't know enough in order to do that. So I just want to, first of all, thank you for coming, and second, thank you for opening our eyes.
And I should say sometime because of, only this is still on, sometime because of my work, I actually want to thank you, Jennifer, for initiating the conversation about me coming and the opportunity to be here. And I want to also thank Dr. Majid for the work you are doing with the Center for Global Humanities. I think it's actually where the future lies. And there's a whole talk I could have on the question of intersectionality and that point where discipline much as it offers opportunity to have a language in which to address issues. Thank you. It can be limiting to have a space where others are able to really come together and collectively engage in the production of knowledge and what that means. It's really central to how I think institutions should be looking at a sense of community or intellectual community in university.
This is a wonderful talk today at noon and also this evening. I was reminded, something you said earlier reminded me of something that a friend of my father said. Her name was Nell Morton, and she's a feminist theologian. She said the longest journey on earth is the journey into the presence of the person nearest to you. And yeah, I believe she actually said the furthest, but the furthest journey on earth is the journey into the presence of the person nearest to you. And I was reminded, I think, when you talked about, the mind to heart journey, what struck me, I guess my question is, do you have any kind of particular tips that you have in terms of helping people to start the journey of this process of getting ready to be open to another culture? Because it seems like there's so many layers to that process, and I just wonder, have you discovered things that help to move it along?
For me, that occurs at different level. I have a journal club with my student, and I was telling Jen about this, where we take turn. I pick the first article, and I've come to actually believe that mine is the least imaginative of articles that we end up reading, because they come up with some really brilliant article that is quite engaging. And for me, is the process of trying to get different groups to start with what we know, get some materials together, and have people really talking through some of the issue and having discussion around which we begin to think through what does it mean. And I'm serious about knowing who you are without what you do. What does it mean to really understand connecting with somebody else when you are not really constantly trying to refer to professional title or professional identity? There was a travel lodge that was done 2 years ago that actually brought this issue to a head. Professor Skip Gates at Harvard had gone through different African countries trying to document the roots of slave trade, and part of his project was really to see how you can also hold some African chiefs responsible for what their role was in being complicit in the slave trade. But he went to Ethiopia and the Orthodox Church and was talking to the Holy Patriarch. And first of all, he appeared on a T-shirt. I have a T-shirt. And you can see when patriarch looked at him, because over 60% of Ethiopia belong to the Orthodox Church, looked at him, and I can never forget, he apologized. I say, I'm sorry, I was just coming from someplace. I just wanted to talk to you. And he looked at him and said, you are as you wish to be. And to me, it was a profound statement that I think Gates is a brilliant scholar. I mean, people know about him through the BS Summit, but he's made a lot of contribution. But it's always been this issue of trying, to me, what I consider, because I was asked to respond to it, I said, well, he represents the issue we have in the academy of our inability to think or know who we are without what we do. Because at the level of connecting with someone at that level, there's a different way that he would have approached it. But as someone who is coming from an institution highly respected, he wasn't making that separation. Or someone who grew up in West Virginia, and some of the things that he's written about, there are different ways that I could have made that connection. So and I think I really strongly believe that if we understand and accept the reality that we are always learning, and one of my students just finished her doctorate, and I was asked to make a comment about her success, and I talked about her ability to separate what she does from who she is, and which means when her article is critiqued, to be able to turn it around and know that they are not critiquing her. They are critiquing I said, a lot of people know that in the academy, but to actualize it is not always easy. But for a graduate student to already recognize that, it means that she knows, if you critique my work, it is the work. It's not impersonal. I mean, some will argue, well, there's some cases that are personal, that's fine, but it's not impersonal. So in our conversation, when I meet with students and in a group, and these are some of the groundwork I try to lay, that you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable in some cases. You have to understand that you don't have all the answer. As one of my colleagues said, you don't have any answer. And that you are really trying to understand at what point you corner, which means making a mistake is not a problem. It's really learning from them and working from there. Yeah.
Last question, and then we have a reception. It would appear at the moment that much of the money that we're expending on health care in Africa from this country is very disease-specific. We try to provide diagnosis and drugs for HIV, AIDS, the same thing for TB, mosquito netting for malaria, and so on, with obviously quite variable results in general. I wonder if it is the best strategy for helping them with their health care needs, and whether, in fact, a better strategy would use much of that money toward helping them develop the infrastructure they need to provide care. If you could devise an overall strategy, where would you put your money?
I think you just said it. No, seriously, because the structure and system makes it. I talked about U.S. and France. Some of the problem we face in this country is that we tend to undervalue the importance of structure and how structure then creates system. And sometimes I worry that if the current political thinking were true in the 50s, we probably would not have the superhighways that the U.S. is known for. It would be a totally different. I'm not even talking about Medicare and Medicaid. Some of the structural things we take for granted. So the structure of governance that allow the sort of things that you need to eliminate some of the episodic response to issues require structure, require investment in structures that connect people, that move people around. That is what Europe has over the U.S. in standard structure. So the investment in the structure is so crucial. And then when you also go back in time, I can look at Nigeria 20 years or when I was there, the system ran better because the structure was there. But you have successive individuals who came into power for how much they are going to get out of oil, not necessarily what they are able to put into it. And you have years of decay because of military dictatorship. So the current government is really facing an uphill battle trying to pick up on those areas that government invested in years ago that were left to decay. The structure is so important, but within the structure is the culture that then defines how you reorient everyone and how you understand the nature of relationship that occurs within the society.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.